Hiber-Nation 12. Grizzly's Growls presents Stories from the Hiber-Nation. A handy guide for beggars, especially those of the poetic fraternity. Being sundry explorations made while afoot and penniless in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. These adventures convey and illustrate the rules of beggary for poets and some others. By Vachel Lindsay. These are the rules of the road. Keep away from cities. Keep away from the railroads. Have nothing to do with money and carry no baggage. Ask for dinner about 11:15. Ask for supper, lodging, and breakfast about 5:15. Travel alone. Be neat, deliberate, chaste, and civil. Preach the gospel of beauty. And without further parley, let us proceed to inculcate these by illustration, precept, and dogma. Vachel Lindsay, Springfield, Illinois, November 1916. Part 1. Vagrant Adventures in the South. The House of the Loom, being the story of 7 aristocrats and a soap kettle, an eminent instance of the good fortune of the devotee of voluntary poverty. With no sorrow in my heart, with no money in my pocket, with no baggage but a lunch, the most dazzling feature of which was a piece of gingerbread, I walked away from a wind-swept North Carolina village one afternoon over the mountain ridges toward Lake Toxaway. I turned to right once too often and climbed Mount Whiteside. There was a drop of millions of miles and a Lilliputian valley below like a landscape by Charlotte B. Coleman. I heard some days later that once a man tied a dog to an umbrella and threw him over. The dog landed safely, barking still. Dog was able to eat and walk and wag as before. But the fate of the master was horrible. The dog never spoke to him again. Having no umbrella, I retraced my way. I stepped into the highway that circumscribes the tremendous amphitheater of Cashier's Valley. I met not a soul till 8 o'clock that night. The mountain laurel, the sardis bloom, the violet, and the apple blossom made glad margins the splendidly built road. And as long as the gingerbread lasted, I looked upon these things in a sort of sophisticated wonder. This was because the gingerbread was given to me by a civilized man, to whom John Collier had written for me a letter of introduction. Mr. Thomas G. Harbison, botanical collector, American tree seeds a specialty. Well, back there by the village, he was improving the breed of mountain apples by running a nursery. He was improving the children with a school he taught without salary, and was using the most modern pedagogy. And something in his manner made me say, "You are like a doctor out of one of those Ibsen plays, only you are optimistic." Well, then we talked of Ibsen. He debated art versus science, he being a science fanatic, as I an art fanatic. He concluded the argument with these words: "You are bound to be wrong. I am bound to be wrong. What is the use of either of us in judging the other?" That is not the mountain way of ending a discussion. Now, for the purposes of this tale, as well as for his own merits, we must praise this civilized man who entertained me a day and a half so well. His mountain cottage was a permanent civilized camp. Without intruding on his privacy, we can show what that means. Cross a few states to the west with me. Have you ever watched the camps of the up-to-date visitors in the oldest parts of Colorado? They begin with a tent, axe, blanket, bacon, and frying pan, as the miners do. In 10 summers, though they climb as much as the miners, wear uglier boots and rougher clothes, their tents are highly organized. They are convenient and free from clutter as the best New York flat. The axe has multiplied rustic benches, bridges, shelters. It has made a refrigerator in the stream. The frying pan is changed into a camp stove and a box of white granite dishes. The blanket flowers and mariposa lilies that made the aspen grove celestial have been gathered in jardinières. Meanwhile, in the big houses of the veteran miners of the village are the axe, the blanket, and the frying pan, though their lords have been through half a dozen fortunes since pioneer days. Those houses have the single great advantage of a rich tradition. They seem to grow up out of the ground. Amusing on these matters, I munched my gingerbread, walking past sweet waterfalls, groves of enormous cedars, many springs, one deserted cabin. I was homesick for that great civilized camp, New York, and the sober-minded pursuit of knowledge there. But civilization lost her battle at twilight when I swallowed my last gingerbread crumb. Immediately, I was in the land beyond the nowhere place, willing to sleep 12 hours by a waterfall or let fairies wake me before the day. The road went deeper into savagery. I blundered on, rejoicing in the fever of weariness. In the piercing light of the young stars, the house that came at last before me seemed even more deeply rooted in the ground than the oaks around it. What new revelation lies here? Knock, 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 O my soul, and may heaven open a mystery that will give the traveler a contrite heart. Let us tell a secret even before we enter. If, with the proper magic in our minds, we were guests here a year or a day, we might write the world's one unwritten epic. All day, in one of those tiny rooms, amid appointments that fill the spirit with the elation of simple things, we would write. At evening, we would dream the next event by the fire. The epic would begin with the opening of the door. There appeared a military figure with a face like Henry Irving's in contour, like Whistler's in sharpness, fantasy, and pride. May I have a night's lodging? I have no money. Well, come in. We never turn a man away. We were inside. He asked, "What might be your name?" Well, I gave it. He gave his. The circle by the fire did not turn their heads, but presumably I was introduced. One child ran into the kitchen. My host gave me her chair. All looked silently into the great soap kettle in the midst of the snapping logs. I have a high opinion of the fine people of the South, and gratefully remember the scattering of gentlefolk so good as to entertain me in their mansions. But in this cottage, with one glance at those fixed, flushed faces, I said, "This is the best blood I have met in the United States." The 5 children were night-blooming flowers. There were hints of Doré in the shadow of the father, cast against the log walls of the cabin. He sat on the little stairway. He was a better Don Quixote than Doré ever knew. I said, "Every middle-aged man I have met in Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina has been a soldier, and I suppose you were." He looked at me long, as though the obligation of hospitality did not involve conversation. He spoke at last. "I fought, but I could not help it. It was for home, or against home. I fought for this cabin." Well, it is a beautiful cabin. He relented a bit. "We have kept it just so, ever since my great-grandfather came here with his pack mule and made his own trail. I hated the war. We did not care anything about the cotton and the niggers of the fire-eaters. The niggers never climbed this high." I changed the subject. "This is the largest fireplace I've seen in the South. Man could stand up in it." He stiffened again. "This is not the South. This is the Blue Ridge." An inner door opened. It was plain the woman who stood there was his wife. She had the austere's mouth a wife's passion gives. She had the sweet white throat of her youth that made even the candle flame rejoice. She looked straight at me with ink-black eyes. She was dumb, like someone struggling to wake. "Everything's ready," she said at length to her husband. He turned to me. "Your supper is now in the kitchen, if what we have is good enough." He was the usual formula for hospitality. I turned to the wife. "My dear woman, I did not know that this was going on. It is not right for you to set a new supper at this hour. I had enough on the road." "But you walked a long way." And then she uttered the ancient proverb of the Blue Ridge. "A stranger needs taken care of." In the kitchen there was a cook stove. Otherwise there was nothing to remind one of the world this side of Beowulf. I felt myself in a stronghold of a barbarian royalty. "Do you do your own spinning and weaving?" She lifted the candle, lighting a corner. "Here are the cards and wools." She held it higher. "There's the spinning wheel." "Where's the loom?" "Oh, upstairs, just by where you'll sleep." I knew if there was a loom, it was a magic one, for she was a witch of the better sort, a fine, serious witch, and a princess withal. Her ancestors wore their black hair that simple way when their lords won them by fighting dragons. She was prouder than the pyramids. If the epic is ever written, let it tell how the spinner of the wizard wools did stand to serve the stranger, that being the custom of her house. This was a primitive camp indeed. There was no gingerbread. There was not one thing to remind me of the last table at which I had eaten, but every gesture said, "Good prince, you are far from your court. Therefore this, our royal trencher, is yours. May you find your way to your own kingdom in peace." But for a long time her lips were still. She had the spareness of a fertile, toiling mother, and all the motherhood in her voice when she said at last, "My son, you are tired." Let the epic tell that when the stranger returned to the fireplace, a restless, expectant silence settled down upon the circle. There was portent in the hiss of the flames. When I spoke to the children, they only stared at me as at a curious shadow. Their lips moved not. The eldest, about 17, had inherited, no doubt, his love of strange brewing. He looked sideways into the soap kettle. I said to myself, he sees more hippogriffs than steam engines. He eyed every move of the circle with restless approval or disapproval. Every chip his little brother threw on the fire seemed to be a symbol of some precious thing sacrificed. Every curl of steam seemed to have something to do with the destiny of the house. He took out of his pocket a monthly magazine. It was the sort that cost 10 cents a year. No doubt he'd gone to school to the admirable man who gave me the gingerbread. He would have learned to read scientific and technical monthlies, but a magazine of any sort is a terribly intrusive thing at this juncture. The young boy, and a sister just a little younger, read in a loud whisper to one another an advertisement they did not want me to hear. At their stage of culture it was impossible to read silently. The advertisement, if I remember, went about this way. "Free, free, free, a sewing machine. Send us your 2-cent stamp, your name and address. Mention the name of this magazine. We will tell you how to get an up-to-date sewing machine absolutely free. This offer is good for 30 days. They wrote a most unscholarly letter, spelling it aloud. It required their total and united culture to produce it. And when the girl returned to the fire, she was provoked by her pride into an astonishing flush. How it set off her temples, with their pattern of azure veins, her lotus-leaf hands, the hands of Hathor, the goddess of love. She cooled her cheeks again and again. There is something of breeding in every color of blood. Come, brothers of the road, all who travel with me in fancy, will you not join the knighthood of the soap kettle? Come, ladies in mansions, will you not be one with us? None of you could have gainsaid the maiden-in-chief of the assembly. She wore her homespun as Zenobia, princess of Palmyra, wore her splendors. With her arms around her 2 gypsy younger sisters, she smiled at last into the soap kettle. When the epic is written, let it use words of marveling, speaking of her hair, so pale, so electrical, set in thick, ingenious coronal. All the little children stood up. "Uncle!" they shouted. Hoofs sounded by the door. A man entered without knocking. When he saw me, he became ceremonious as a mandarin. "This is a traveler," said my host. The messenger indulged in inquiries about my welfare, journey, and destination. My host interrupted. "How's mother? We have watched late to know." "Oh, she's much worse," the messenger went on to say. "She might not live 2 days. And the doctor was a careless, indifferent dog, treating her as though she were an ordinary old woman." "Does he still give a strychnine?" "He won't deny it." The messenger explained the doctor thought strychnine in small doses was good for old people. The scientist who gave me gingerbread should have been there to champion the doctor. In the eyes of his judges that night, he was suspected of poisoning and treating with criminal folly royalty itself. And the younger doctor was miles away, might refuse to take the trip. The 2 loyal sons seemed paralyzed because the time for decision and the time for mourning came together. There were long silences, interrupted by my host repeating in a sort of primitive song, "I can't think of anything except my dying mother. I can't think of anything except my mother is going to die." At last, with his brother's consent, the messenger galloped away to find his only hope, the younger physician. As the wife gave me the candle, sending me upstairs, I looked back at the family circle. Helpless grief made every face rigid. I looked again at the eldest daughter. The moving shadows embroidered on her breast intricate symbols of the fair years, passing in the ghost of tapestry, things that happened in the beginning of the world. Let the epic tell that when the stranger slept, there was a magic loom by his bed that wove that history again in valiant colors, showing battles without number, and sieges, and interminable sunny love tales, and lotus-headed ladies whispering over manuscript things too fine to be told, and ruddy warriors sitting at watchfires on battlements eternal. And let the epic tell how in the early dawn the stranger half awoke, yet saw this tapestry hung round the walls. If one could remember every story for which the picture stood, he might indeed write the world's unwritten epic. The last tapestry to be hung changed from gold to black warp and woof, upon which was written that because of a treacherous prime minister who soothed a poisoned wine, the empress of the White Witches was perishing before her time, and the young wizard with the counterspell was riding night and day, but all the palace knew he would arrive too late. At breakfast, the faces were stolid and white as frost. The father answered me only when I said goodbye. He said he hardly knew whether I had had anything to eat or whether anyone had been good to me. "You just take care of yourself." The son, feeling the demand of hospitality in his father's voice, walked to the road with me. He asked if I was walking to Asheville. Yes, by way of Mount Toxaway and Brevard. He told me it was good walking all the way, and added in a difficult burst of confidence, "I'm not going to Asheville." "Why not come along with me?" I asked. I meant it heartily. He said he had to take horseback and then the railway, had to be there tomorrow. "What's the hurry?" "I have to witness in a whiskey case, an Internal Revenue case." He said it like a Spanish Protestant called before the Inquisition. I said to my soul, these were the revelations of a night and a morning. What deeper troubles were in the house of the loom that you did not know? All through the country there had been that night what is called a black frost. By the roadside it was deep and white as the wool on a sheep, but it left things blighted and black and destroyed the chances of the fruit-bearing trees. All the way to Mount Toxaway I met scattered mourners of the ill-timed visitation. But the simple folly of spring was in me, and the strange elation of gratitude. My soul said within itself, a money claim has definite limits, but when will you ever discharge your obligation to the proud and the fine in the house of the loom? You intruded on their grief, yet they held their guest sacred as their grief. Phidias. Would that joy of living came today even as sculpted on Athena's shrine, in sunny conclave of serene design, maidens and men, procession, flute, and feast, by Phidias, the ivory-hearted priest of beauty absolute, whose eyes the sun showed goodlier forms than our desires can guess, and more of happiness. Thanks for listening to Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Comment on the website at grizzly.libsyn.com. This program is sponsored by donations from people like you and is released with a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.